The smoke rose in two perfect columns from the clearing, visible against the gray November sky for anyone within 15 miles who knew to look. Thomas Mercer knelt beside his apparatus, watching the dual plumes climb straight and unwavering into the cold Montana air. 3 miles to the northwest, his partner would see the signal and understand its meaning immediately. Danger. Come armed. What separated this moment from countless others in the wilderness was not the message itself, but the fact that Thomas had delivered it without firing a shot, without shouting, without revealing his position to the Blackfoot war party that had been tracking him since dawn. Before we continue, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. And if you want to hear more stories about frontier innovation that changed American history, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more remarkable than this one. Thomas Mercer heard the gunshots at midday. 3 rapid reports, echoing through the pine valleys, then a fourth after a long pause, then silence. He was checking his trap line along Beaver Creek, 2 miles south of the camp he shared with Daniel Kirkwood. They had been partners for 3 seasons, working the tributaries of the Clark Fork River in what would one day become western Montana. The year was 1839, and the fur trade was still profitable enough to risk your life for. Thomas knew immediately something was wrong. Daniel was checking traps to the north. 4 shots meant trouble. 1 shot was game. 2 shots were signaling location. 3 shots meant distress. 4 shots meant come immediately. They had agreed on these signals the previous winter after spending 2 weeks trapped in separate cabins during a blizzard, unable to communicate, each man wondering if the other had frozen to death. Thomas abandoned his trap line and ran. 2 miles through mountain terrain took 40 minutes even when you were moving fast. He followed the creek north, then cut east through a stand of lodgepole pine where the ground was more level. His breath came hard in the November cold. His rifle, a reliable Hawken that had served him well for 5 years, grew heavy in his hands. He tried not to think about what 4 shots might mean. Bear attack, hostile encounter, injury from a fall, all of them bad. He found Daniel a quarter mile from their northern trap line. A grizzly had caught him at a beaver dam where the creek pooled behind a natural barrier of mud and branches. The bear had come from downwind, probably drawn by the scent of beaver carcasses Daniel had been processing. Daniel had managed to fire 4 times. The bear had killed him anyway. Thomas stood over his partner's body for a long time. The bear was gone, likely wounded based on the blood trail leading into the willows. Daniel's rifle lay 10 feet away, empty. His trapping knife was still in its sheath. Everything had happened too fast for anything beyond those 4 desperate shots. 4 shots that Thomas had heard 2 miles away. 4 shots that had brought Thomas running. 4 shots that had been completely useless because 2 miles might as well have been 20 when a man was dying. Thomas buried Daniel on a hillside with a view of the creek they had trapped together. He used rocks to mark the grave because the ground was already too frozen for a proper wooden marker. That night, back in their cabin, he sat by the fire and thought about distance. In the mountains, trappers spread out across vast territories, following game and beaver populations. You might have partners, but you worked alone most days. The distances kept you safe from competition and conflict. The distances also killed you when you needed help. Daniel's 4 shots had reached Thomas, but they had reached him too late. Thomas spent the winter of 1839 to 1840 alone in the cabin he had built with Daniel. The isolation should have driven him to town, to Street Louis, or one of the trading posts where trappers gathered during the cold months. Instead, he stayed in the mountains and became obsessed with a single problem. How do you talk to someone you cannot see? Gunshots were the standard method. Every trapper knew the basic codes: 1 shot for game, 2 for location, 3 for distress, 4 for emergency. But gunshots had fatal limitations. They carried perhaps 3 miles in open terrain, less in heavy forest, or when wind was wrong. They wasted powder and lead, resources that were expensive and difficult to resupply. Most critically, they announced your presence to everyone within range. Hostile war parties, competing trappers, predators, all of them heard your shots just as clearly as your intended recipient. Thomas had heard stories of trappers who arranged meeting points, designated locations where partners would converge at set times to exchange information. The system worked until it didn't. Meeting points required travel, sometimes several miles through dangerous country. If one man was injured or trapped by weather, the system collapsed. If hostile forces controlled the territory between you and the meeting point, you simply didn't go. The meeting point method traded one set of dangers for another. He observed how various Indian tribes used smoke signals. The Crow, the Blackfoot, the Shoshone, all of them had systems for distance communication using fire and smoke. Thomas watched from concealment one afternoon as a Crow hunting party sent signals across a valley. Single columns of smoke rising into clear sky, visible for miles. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Build a fire, create smoke, cover and uncover the smoke to create puffs or sustained columns. But Thomas saw the limitations immediately. A single column of smoke was ambiguous. Was it a signal? Was it a campfire? Was it a forest fire? Even if you knew it was intentional, what did it mean? The puff patterns could convey basic information if you knew the code, but they required constant attention. Someone had to stand by the fire, manipulating the covering, maintaining the flame. You couldn't signal and work simultaneously. You certainly couldn't signal and defend yourself if the signal attracted unwanted attention. Thomas spent long evenings that winter sketching ideas in charcoal on pieces of birch bark. He drew diagrams of fire pits, arrangements of rocks, sequences of smoke patterns. Nothing satisfied him. He needed something that was unmistakable, something that couldn't be confused with natural phenomena or accidental fires. He needed something that could convey specific information, not just alert someone to your presence. He needed something that didn't require you to stand exposed beside a fire, vulnerable to anyone who saw your signal. The answer came to him in March, not from inspiration, but from accident and careful observation of something he had seen 100 times without understanding its significance. Thomas was splitting firewood in late March when he found the answer he had been searching for all winter. The spring thaw had begun, but nights were still cold enough to require a fire. He had been working through a pile of deadfall pine he had dragged to the cabin weeks earlier. Most of the logs were solid, dense wood that split cleanly with his axe. Then he struck one that felt different. The log was perhaps 3 feet long and a foot in diameter. The bark was intact, showing no obvious signs of rot, but when Thomas's axe bit into it, the log split with unusual ease. The interior was partially hollow. Carpenter ants had excavated tunnels through the heartwood, creating a network of chambers and passages that ran the length of the log. The structural wood remained sound, but the interior was a maze of insect-carved channels. Thomas examined the split log with interest beyond what firewood normally warranted. He could see how the tunnels connected and branched, how some passages led to exit holes in the bark while others dead-ended deep in the wood. The pattern was random, created by insects following the grain, but it gave Thomas an idea that made him forget about firewood entirely. He carried both halves into the cabin and studied the internal structure, tracing passages with his finger. Then he took one half outside, placed it on the ground, and built a small fire inside one of the larger hollowed chambers. The dry wood caught quickly. Within minutes, smoke began emerging from multiple points along the log's length where insect tunnels reached the surface. 3 separate columns of smoke rose from the single piece of wood. They were thin, inconsistent, and died quickly as the fire consumed the dried interior. But Thomas had seen enough. A log with internal passages could produce multiple smoke sources from a single fire. What if the passages were carved intentionally? What if you could control exactly where the smoke emerged? Thomas spent the next 2 weeks experimenting. He selected straight-grained pine, split them lengthwise, and used his knife and a curved chisel to carve channels into the flat interior surfaces. Then he bound the halves back together with rawhide strips, creating logs with hidden internal passages. His first attempts failed. The channels were too wide, causing the wood to burn through. The binding method was inadequate, allowing smoke to escape from seams. He adjusted his technique with each attempt. He made the channels narrower, barely wider than his thumb. He carved them deeper, leaving more structural material around them. He drilled clean holes through the bark at specific locations rather than relying on carved vents. He wrapped iron wire around the exterior to hold the halves together tightly. By early April, Thomas had created a log that worked. 2 feet long, 10 inches in diameter, with 2 internal channels running parallel along its length. Each channel exited through a 1/4-inch hole, drilled at opposite ends. When Thomas placed smoldering coals in both channels, 2 distinct columns of smoke rose from the single piece of wood. The columns were steady, consistent, unmistakably intentional. Thomas tested it from 2 miles away. The twin smoke columns stood out clearly against the spring sky. The system worked, but the smoke lasted only 20 minutes before the coals died. To maintain a signal, someone had to stay with the log, constantly feeding it. Thomas had solved one problem. He had not yet solved the problem of making signals sustainable without constant human attention. Thomas spent April perfecting his hollowed log design while wrestling with the sustainability problem. He could create distinctive dual smoke columns that were unmistakable from miles away, but maintaining those columns required constant attention. Every 20 minutes, the coals would cool and the smoke would fade. Someone had to remain beside the log, feeding fresh combustible material into the channels, adjusting airflow, keeping the smolder alive. The system worked, but it defeated the purpose. A trapper couldn't signal for help and defend himself simultaneously. He couldn't warn others of danger while remaining hidden. The problem was oxygen. Fire needed air to burn. Smoldering coals needed even more careful air management to produce thick smoke without bursting into flame. In open air, coals burned too hot and consumed themselves quickly. Sealed completely inside the log channels, they suffocated and died. Thomas needed consistent, controlled airflow that could sustain combustion for extended periods without human intervention. He tried various passive solutions first. He carved additional vent holes in the logs, hoping cross-ventilation would sustain the coals naturally. The smoke became inconsistent, sometimes strong, sometimes barely visible, depending on wind conditions. He tried packing the channels with different materials. Dry moss produced thick smoke, but burned away in minutes. Green leaves smothered the coals. Pine needles created too much flame. Rotted wood produced thin gray smoke that was barely visible from distance. Nothing worked consistently. Thomas filled his cabin with failed experiments, split logs with various channel configurations, each one revealing a new problem without solving the fundamental issue. By late April, he had almost abandoned the entire project. Then he remembered something from his childhood in Pennsylvania. His father had been a farmer, not a wealthy man, but their property had included a small forge for basic metalwork and tool repair. Thomas had spent hours as a boy watching the blacksmith who came twice yearly to shoe horses and mend equipment. He remembered the bellows, a leather apparatus that forced air into the forge fire with each compression. The blacksmith would pump the bellows steadily, and the forge fire would respond, burning hotter and more consistently than any natural fire. The bellows didn't just allow airflow. They controlled it, delivering precise amounts of oxygen exactly when and where it was needed. Thomas didn't have a forge bellows. He didn't have the materials or skills to recreate one at full size, but the principle was sound. If he could create a small bellows, something portable that could force air into his log channels, he could control the combustion. He could maintain steady smoke production without standing over the log, constantly tending it. The bellows could be pumped periodically, perhaps once every few minutes, keeping the coals alive and productive. The idea was sound in theory. Building a functional bellows with frontier materials and basic tools would prove far more challenging than carving channels in logs. Thomas spent the next month learning to work leather, shape wood into precise mechanical components, and solve problems he had never encountered before. The education would transform his smoke signal from an interesting experiment into a genuinely revolutionary communication system. Thomas had never worked with leather beyond basic repairs to his boots and rifle sling. Building a functional bellows required skills he didn't possess and materials he barely understood. He started by sketching what he remembered from his father's forge. The blacksmith's bellows had been simple in concept. 2 wooden boards connected by pleated leather sides that formed an airtight chamber. Compress the boards together and air forced out through a nozzle. Release the boards and the leather pleats expanded, drawing fresh air in through a one-way valve. Repeat the cycle and you had controlled, directed airflow. Thomas's first attempt was laughably oversized. He built it to the dimensions he remembered from childhood, creating a bellows nearly 2 feet long. The device was too heavy to carry, too cumbersome to operate, and produced far more air than his small log channels needed. The blast of oxygen turned his smoldering coals into open flames that consumed the channel walls and destroyed the log within minutes. He needed to think smaller. A trapper's bellows had to be portable, something that could fit in a pack alongside traps and supplies. It had to produce gentle, sustained airflow, not the powerful blasts a forge required. Thomas spent a week reducing the dimensions, creating a bellows no larger than his hand. He used thin pine boards for the rigid components, shaping them carefully with his knife until they were smooth and flat. The leather came from a deer hide he had been saving for winter clothing. He cut it into precise shapes, soaked it in water until it became pliable, then stitched the pieces together with sinew. The small bellows worked better but still produced too much air. Thomas added a restrictor to the nozzle, a simple wooden plug with a tiny hole drilled through its center. The restricted airflow was exactly what he needed. A single compression of the bellows would feed a small puff of air into exant, the log channel, enough to keep coals glowing without creating flame. The system required pumping every few minutes, but that was manageable. A man could pump the bellows while watching his trap line, while eating, while doing any task that allowed one free hand. The connection between bellows and log presented its own challenges. Thomas tried leather tubes, but they collapsed under compression. He tried hollowed willow branches, but they cracked and leaked air. Finally, he discovered that a simple brass tube, salvaged from a broken powder measure he had been carrying for years, worked perfectly. The metal tube was rigid, airtight, and small enough to insert directly into the log's channel entrance. He sealed the connection with pine resin mixed with clay, creating a joint that was both airtight and heat-resistant. By late May, Thomas had a complete system: a modified log with 2 internal channels, a hand-sized leather bellows, and a brass connecting tube. He could set up the apparatus in minutes, pump the bellows every 5 minutes to maintain airflow, and produce 2 steady columns of white smoke for as long as he had combustible material in the channels. The system was portable, sustainable, and distinctive. It was almost perfect, almost. Thomas had solved the technical problems, but he had not yet created a language. 2 columns of smoke rising from the wilderness were distinctive enough to catch attention, but what did they mean? Without agreed-upon signals, his invention was nothing more than an elaborate way to say, "I am here." He needed a code, a system of patterns that could convey specific information across miles of mountain terrain. He started with the simplest possibilities. Both columns, smoking meant one thing. Left column only meant another. Right column only meant a third option. No smoke meant a fourth state. With just these 4 basic signals, Thomas could create a vocabulary. He assigned meanings based on what trappers most needed to communicate. Both columns burning became all clear, no danger. Left column only became danger present, stay away. Right column only became assistance needed, non-urgent. No smoke, or the absence of expected smoke, became abandoning location, moving camp. The system worked for basic communication, but Thomas realized he could add complexity through timing. If he pumped the bellows in specific rhythms, he could create patterns within patterns. 3 quick pumps, followed by a pause, created pulsing smoke. Sustained pumping created steady columns. Alternating between channels created a flickering effect where first one column would strengthen, then the other. These variations added layers of meaning to the basic 4-signal vocabulary. Thomas spent a week in early June testing visibility and clarity from various distances and terrain types. He hiked to different vantage points, sometimes 5 miles from his signal location, sometimes 10, once nearly 15 miles across 2 mountain valleys. The dual columns remained visible at remarkable distances, especially against clear sky or dark forest backgrounds. Morning and evening provided the best visibility when the low sun created contrast. Midday was more challenging, but even then, the distinctive twin-column pattern stood out from natural smoke or fires. He discovered that terrain mattered enormously. Signals sent from high ground clearings could be seen from valleys below and ridges beyond. Signals from low valleys were often blocked by intervening hills. Thomas began mapping the territory around his trap lines, identifying which locations offered the best signal visibility to the largest area. These became his designated signal points, places where the apparatus could be set up with confidence that it would be seen. The real breakthrough came when Thomas realized the system didn't require perfection. Two trappers didn't need to memorize dozens of complex signals. They needed to agree on perhaps 6 or 8 critical messages, the situations most likely to require distance communication, danger warnings, calls for assistance, location changes, supply caches, all clear confirmations, and perhaps a few others. Beyond that, the simple fact of seeing the distinctive dual-column smoke was itself communication. It meant your partner was alive, active, and in position. In the isolation of mountain trapping, that basic confirmation of continued existence was valuable. By mid-June, Thomas had refined his code to 8 distinct signals, using combinations of column activation and pumping rhythm. The system was learnable in an afternoon, memorable after a few days of practice, and unmistakable in execution. Now he needed to teach it to someone else. Thomas encountered James Ridgway in late June at a creek where their trap lines overlapped. Ridgway was a solitary trapper, older than Thomas by perhaps 10 years, with a reputation for competence and a general distrust of new ideas. He trapped alone, traded alone, and made it clear he preferred that arrangement. When Thomas explained his smoke signal system, Ridgway's skepticism was immediate and unconcealed. "You spent 3 months building a fancy way to make smoke?" Ridgway examined the compact bellows and modified log Thomas had brought to demonstrate. "I can make smoke with flint and steel in 30 seconds. Thomas didn't argue. He simply set up the apparatus in a clearing, loaded both channels with prepared combustible material he had developed, a mixture of dry moss, pine resin, and finely shredded bark that produced thick white smoke with minimal flame. He connected the bellows, gave it several pumps, and stepped back. 2 perfect columns of white smoke rose into the still morning air, distinct and unwavering. "That's impressive to look at," Ridgway admitted. "But it's just smoke. Could be anything." Thomas demonstrated the code. He stopped pumping the left channel, allowing that column to fade while the right continued. Then he reversed it. Then he created pulsing patterns by varying his pumping rhythm. Then he extinguished both columns and restarted them in sequence. Ridgway watched without comment until Thomas finished. "And you think someone 5 miles away can read those patterns?" 10 miles, in clear conditions," Thomas said. "I've tested it." Ridgway studied the apparatus for another minute. "What happens when I'm the one who needs help and you're the one who has to see it?" "You build your own," Thomas said. He spent the next 2 hours teaching Ridgway how to carve the log channels, construct a simple bellows, prepare the smoke mixture, and operate the system. Ridgway asked practical questions about durability, about how long the components lasted, about whether the system worked in wind or rain. Thomas answered honestly, acknowledging limitations. Heavy rain made smoke signals impossible. Strong wind dispersed the columns too quickly. But in normal conditions, the system worked, reliably. Ridgway left that afternoon with measurements and instructions, but without commitment. Thomas didn't expect to see him again. Mountain men were independent by nature, and many would consider the effort required to build the apparatus wasted time. Thomas returned to his own trap lines and thought no more about it. 5 weeks later, in early August, Thomas was working a beaver pond 6 miles south of his cabin when he saw smoke on the northern horizon. 2 columns, distinctly spaced, pulsing in the pattern he had taught Ridgway. The pattern meant danger, hostile presence, stay away. Thomas had been planning to head north that afternoon to check his upper trap line. Instead, he retreated south, found a concealed camp, and waited. The next morning, he saw different smoke. Single column, steady, from Ridgway's usual area. The all-clear signal. Thomas approached cautiously and found Ridgway alive and angry. A Blackfoot raiding party had passed through the territory the previous day, 8 warriors moving south, Ridgway told other trappers. Thomas hadn't asked him to spread the word, but mountain men talked when they crossed paths at trading posts or shared camps during seasonal migrations. By autumn of 1840, at least a dozen trappers in the Clark Fork region had built their own signal apparatus. Some copied Thomas's design exactly. Others made modifications based on their own experience and available materials. The variations didn't matter as long as the core principle remained. Two distinct smoke columns from a single source, controlled by a portable bellows capable of producing agreed-upon signal patterns. The code standardized organically. Trappers who encountered each other would compare their signal meanings, adjust for consistency, and spread the refined version to others. By winter, most men using the system recognized the same 8 basic signals. Both columns steady meant all clear. Left only meant danger present, right only meant assistance needed. Various pulsing patterns indicated moving location, supplies cached, meeting requested, or other specific messages. The system wasn't perfect, and regional variations existed, but it was functional across a network that now spanned nearly 100 miles of mountain territory. Thomas spent the winter of 1840 to 41 alone again, but the isolation felt different. He could see signal smoke from his cabin on clear days, usually from 2 or 3 different locations. The signals were rarely directed at him specifically. Often they were simply positional confirmations, trappers letting the network know they were alive and active. Sometimes they conveyed information meant for whoever might see it. Danger warnings about aggressive bear activity in specific drainages, notifications about depleted beaver populations in overtrapped areas. Occasionally, requests for trade or offers to share surplus supplies. The network created an invisible community across the wilderness. Men who still worked alone and lived isolated now had a thread of connection that changed the psychology of mountain trapping. You weren't truly alone if you could see a signal and know another human was within range. You weren't helpless if you could call for assistance across distances that would have been impossible before. Spring of 1841 brought the first major test of the network's value beyond simple communication. Marcus Webb, a trapper working the tributaries 15 miles north of Thomas's location, broke his leg in a fall while checking traps in late March. The injury was serious but not immediately life-threatening. Webb managed to drag himself back to his cabin, but he couldn't walk, couldn't hunt, and couldn't tend his trap lines. In previous years, an injured trapper alone would simply die, either from the injury itself or from starvation as supplies ran out. Webb set up his signal apparatus and began sending the assistance needed pattern every morning. Within 2 days, the nearest trapper saw the signal and responded. Within a week, 3 different trappers had visited Webb's cabin, bringing food, firewood, and basic medical supplies. They took turns checking his trap line so he wouldn't lose an entire season's work. They stayed until Webb could walk again, roughly 6 weeks later. The silent network had saved his life without any dramatic rescue or heroic intervention. The avalanche hit on February 9, 1842. A massive snowslide triggered by an unusual warm spell swept down the north face of a peak the trappers called Bald Mountain. The slide buried a narrow valley where 4 trappers had established winter camps within 2 miles of each other. 3 of them, Gregory Stone, Peter Marsh, and Robert Coulter, survived the initial slide, but found themselves trapped in a landscape transformed by thousands of tons of snow and debris. Stone's cabin was partially crushed but remained standing. Marsh and Coulter had been outside checking supplies when the avalanche hit. They survived by running laterally out of the slide path, but their cabins were completely buried. The 3 men regrouped at Stone's damaged structure as darkness fell. They had limited supplies, no access to their cached food stores buried under snow, and faced the reality that the next major storm could finish what the avalanche had started. Stone had his signal apparatus, one of the few pieces of equipment that had survived the cabin's partial collapse. The bellows was damaged but functional. The modified log was intact. The combustible materials he kept prepared in a waterproof leather pouch were dry and usable. That night, working by firelight in the partially collapsed cabin, Stone set up the signal in the one clearing visible from outside the avalanche zone. He began signaling at dawn. Both columns steady, then left only, repeated in the pattern that meant multiple persons need assistance, urgent. The signal was visible from several vantage points along the ridges that bordered the affected valley, but whether anyone was in position to see it was unknown. Stone maintained the signal throughout the day, pumping the bellows every few minutes, replenishing the combustible material as it depleted, keeping the twin columns of white smoke rising against the gray winter sky. 20 miles southeast, Thomas saw the smoke. He was checking his upper trap line from a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding mountains. The distant dual columns were barely visible, but the pattern was unmistakable once he recognized it. Someone needed help urgently. Thomas noted the direction, estimated the location, and made a decision that probably saved 3 lives. He didn't head directly toward the signal. Instead, he returned to his own cabin, set up his signal apparatus, and began relaying Stone's message. 2 other trappers within visual range of Thomas's position saw his signal within hours. They understood that Thomas was relaying, not originating, the call for help. They set up their own signals, passing the message further along the network. By nightfall of that first day, at least 8 trappers across a 50-mile range knew that someone in the Bald Mountain area needed urgent assistance. The response was coordinated without any central planning. Trappers headed toward the signal's origin from multiple directions, some bringing medical supplies, others bringing food, several bringing rope and tools for digging. Thomas reached Stone's location on the evening of the second day, along with 2 other trappers who had approached from different directions. The rescue operation lasted 4 days. 9 trappers converged on the avalanche site, guided by Stone's persistent signal smoke that continued rising even as rescuers arrived. They dug out the buried cabins, recovered cached supplies, and ensured the 3 trapped men had enough provisions and shelter to survive. Until spring. No one died. No one suffered permanent injury beyond Stone's frostbitten fingers from maintaining the signal apparatus in sub-zero temperatures. The silent network had transformed what would have been a tragedy into a story of coordinated survival. Thomas Mercer continued trapping until 1846, when the beaver population declined to the point that the profession no longer sustained a living. He left the mountains and settled in the Oregon Territory, buying a small farm near the Willamette Valley. He married in 1847, raised 3 children, and lived quietly until his death in 1873 at the age of 61. His obituary made no mention of smoke signals or wilderness innovation. To his family and community, he was simply a former trapper who had become a farmer. But in the mountains, the system he had created outlived him by decades. Trappers continued using dual-column smoke signals throughout the 1840s and 50s. As the fur trade collapsed, prospectors and hunters adopted the technique. Early settlers moving into mountain valleys learned the code from mountain men and used it to communicate between isolated homesteads. The U.S. Army experimented with variations of the system for frontier communication in the 1860s, though they eventually abandoned it in favor of heliograph mirrors and telegraph lines. The physical evidence disappeared slowly. The bellows apparatus, built from leather and wood, deteriorated after a few years of hard use. The modified logs burned eventually, either consumed by their own signal fires or used as firewood when no longer needed. No museum preserved a complete Thomas Mercer signal kit. No historical society documented the technical specifications. The innovation survived only in scattered written references, brief mentions in trapper journals and settler diaries about the twin smoke or Mercer's smoke talk. What survived more permanently was the principle. In 1839, mountain men accepted isolation as inevitable. Distance meant danger, because distance meant you were alone. By 1845, that equation had changed. Distance no longer meant isolation if you could communicate across it. The wilderness remained dangerous, but it was no longer silent. Men separated by a dozen miles could coordinate, warn, assist, and confirm each other's existence without firing a shot or leaving their positions. Thomas Mercer's innovation wasn't the technology itself. Hollow logs and leather bellows were simple tools that any competent craftsman could reproduce. The innovation was recognizing that the deadliest aspect of frontier life wasn't bears or hostile encounters or harsh weather. It was isolation. It was the helplessness of being too far away when someone needed you. Thomas had solved that problem not with weapons or fortifications, but with communication. He had given mountain men something they had never possessed before, the ability to speak across distance without sound, to call for help without vulnerability, to transform individual survival into collective resilience. The impossible had become routine, written not in words but in smoke, rising silent and clear above a wilderness that had learned to listen.